Marcus had been walking the same marble corridors for 12 years, his polished boots echoing against the pristine floors of Valdoria Palace. The golden threads in his royal guard uniform caught the morning light streaming through the towering windows. But today something felt different. The weight of his ceremonial sword seemed heavier, and the silence in the halls carried an unusual tension. He paused at the intersection of the east and north wings, where portraits of ancient kings watched him with painted eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Marcus had always found comfort in these familiar faces, but today they appeared to be warning him of something he couldn't yet understand. The palace had been his home since he was 22, when he first took the oath to protect the royal family with his life. King Aldrich had personally selected him from hundreds of candidates, recognizing something in Marcus that even he didn't fully comprehend at the time. The king had spoken of honor and duty, of being the shield between the crown and those who would do it harm. As Marcus continued his morning patrol, he noticed unusual activity near the council chambers. Servants hurried past with their eyes downcast, and even the normally chatty kitchen staff seemed subdued. The head cook, Mrs. Pemberton, who usually greeted him with warm bread and gossip about the nobles, barely acknowledged his presence. Something was stirring in the depths of the palace, something that made the very air feel thick with unspoken words. Marcus had developed a sixth sense for danger during his years of service, and every instinct told him that today would test everything he believed about loyalty and righteousness. The first sign of trouble came during the afternoon briefing. Captain Reynolds, a man Marcus had served under for 8 years, delivered the assignments with an unusual nervousness in his voice. The captain's hands trembled slightly as he handed out the duty rosters, and he avoided making direct eye contact with any of his men. Marcus was assigned to the night watch in the restricted wing of the palace, an area that housed the royal family's private quarters and most sensitive documents. It was an honor typically reserved for the most trusted guards, but tonight it felt more like a burden than a privilege. As evening approached, Marcus made his way to his post. The restricted wing was eerily quiet, with only the soft flickering of torches providing light in the long corridors. He had walked these halls countless times before, but tonight every shadow seemed to hold a secret, and every creak of the old wooden floors made him more alert. Around midnight, Marcus heard voices coming from the king's private study. This was unusual, as King Aldrich typically retired early and rarely held meetings so late. The voices were hushed but urgent, and Marcus could detect anger and frustration in their tones. His training told him to continue his patrol and ignore what might be a private royal matter. Guards were meant to be invisible, to see and hear nothing unless directly commanded. But something in the tenor of the conversation made him pause and listen more carefully. Through the heavy oak door, he could make out the king's voice, strained and weary. There were other voices too, men Marcus recognized as members of the inner council. They were discussing something about the northern provinces, about people who were suffering, about decisions that had been made without the king's knowledge. Marcus felt his heart racing as he began to understand the gravity of what he was overhearing. The conversation revealed a web of deception that reached into the highest levels of government, involving people he had trusted and served faithfully for years. The king's voice rose slightly, filled with anguish. He spoke of betrayal by those closest to him, of policies implemented in his name that went against everything he stood for. Marcus could hear the pain in his monarch's words, the weight of discovering that his own council had been making decisions that harmed his people, while using his authority to justify their actions. As Marcus stood frozen outside the door, he realized he was at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. The oath he had taken years ago suddenly felt more complex than the simple words he had memorized. Protecting the king meant more than just standing guard against physical threats. It meant protecting the values and principles that the crown was supposed to represent. The conversation inside the study grew more heated, and Marcus heard mentions of cover-ups, of silencing those who had tried to speak out, of maintaining the facade of royal approval for actions that were causing suffering throughout the kingdom. The king demanded answers, but the responses from his counselors were evasive and manipulative. Marcus pressed his back against the cold stone wall, his mind racing with the implications of what he was hearing. He thought about his fellow guards, about the servants who had seemed so troubled that morning, about the whispered conversations he had dismissed as mere palace gossip. Everything was beginning to make sense in a way that made his stomach turn. The unusual tension he had felt all day wasn't just his imagination. The palace was harboring dark secrets, and those secrets were about to force him to choose between blind obedience and true honor. As the voices in the study began to fade and he heard the sound of chairs being moved, Marcus quickly resumed his patrol, but his mind was no longer focused on the simple task of walking the corridors and checking doors. Instead, he was grappling with questions that would soon demand answers. The weight of knowledge pressed down on him as he completed his rounds. By the time dawn broke over the palace walls, Marcus knew that his life as a simple guard was over. He had heard too much, understood too much, and felt too deeply to continue pretending that his only duty was to follow orders without question. The morning sun cast long shadows through the palace windows, and Marcus realized that those shadows had always been there. He had simply chosen not to see them until now. But once seen, they could not be ignored, and the path forward would require a courage he had never been asked to demonstrate before. Standing at his post as the palace began to wake around him, Marcus understood that true loyalty might sometimes require the greatest act of disloyalty, and that real honor might demand the sacrifice of everything he had worked to build. The next few days passed like a fever dream for Marcus. He continued his duties with mechanical precision, but his mind was constantly analyzing every interaction, every conversation, every strange look that passed between the palace staff. The knowledge he carried felt like a poison in his blood, making him hyper-aware of the corruption that seemed to permeate every corner of the royal court. During his regular patrol rounds, Marcus began to notice things he had previously overlooked. Servants whispered in corners and fell silent when he approached. Kitchen staff prepared elaborate meals that were sent to parts of the palace he had never been asked to guard. Documents were moved in and out of offices under cover of darkness, and certain council members held meetings in locations that seemed designed to avoid oversight. The most disturbing discovery came when Marcus was assigned to escort a visitor from the northern provinces. The man was thin and weathered, with the desperate look of someone who had traveled far to seek justice. Marcus watched from his position by the door as the man was led into a meeting with Lord Blackwood, one of the king's most trusted advisors. What Marcus witnessed through the partially open door shattered any remaining illusions about the nobility of the royal court. Lord Blackwood dismissed the man's concerns with cold indifference, even laughing at the description of suffering in the northern villages. The visitor spoke of families starving while grain shipments were diverted to wealthy merchants, of tax collectors taking more than what was owed and keeping the excess for themselves. When the desperate man produced documents proving the corruption, Lord Blackwood's demeanor changed completely. His voice became threatening, and he warned the visitor about the consequences of spreading lies about royal policies. Marcus watched as the man's shoulders sagged in defeat, understanding that he had come seeking justice from the very people who were causing his people suffering. After the visitor left empty-handed, Marcus followed him discreetly through the palace corridors. In the courtyard, he caught up with the man as he prepared to begin his long journey home. Speaking in low tones, Marcus asked about the conditions in the northern provinces, claiming it was for an official report. The stories he heard made his blood run cold. Entire families were losing their homes because of impossible tax demands. Children were going hungry while food that belonged to them was sold to the highest bidder. Local officials were living in luxury, while the people they were supposed to serve suffered in silence, too afraid to complain because previous complainers had simply disappeared. Marcus realized that the conversation he had overheard between the king and his council was just the tip of a massive conspiracy. The king was being deliberately kept in the dark about the true conditions in his realm, while his trusted advisors enriched themselves at the expense of his people. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of reporting to his assigned post, he made his way to the palace archives. Using his security clearance, he began searching through official documents, looking for evidence of the corruption he now knew existed. What he found was worse than he had imagined. Tax records showed massive discrepancies between what was collected and what was reported to the royal treasury. Correspondence between regional governors revealed a systematic network of bribery and extortion. Most damning of all were the orders signed with the king's seal that Marcus knew the king had never seen, authorizing policies that directly contradicted everything the monarch stood for. as he copied key documents by candlelight. Marcus heard footsteps in the corridor outside. He quickly extinguished his candle and hid behind a tall shelf of ancient texts, his heart pounding as someone tested the door handle. After several tense minutes, the footsteps moved away, but Marcus realized he was playing a dangerous game. The next morning brought a summons that Marcus had been dreading. Captain Reynolds called him into his office with an expression that mixed concern and suspicion. The captain closed the door carefully and studied Marcus for a long moment before speaking. The captain revealed that certain members of the council had noticed Marcus asking unusual questions and showing interest in matters beyond his duties. There had been reports of him speaking with visitors and accessing areas of the palace without proper authorization. The captain's tone was warning rather than accusatory, but the message was clear. Marcus maintained his composure and provided reasonable explanations for his actions, but he could see that the captain wasn't entirely convinced. The conversation ended with a reminder about the importance of discretion and loyalty, and a suggestion that Marcus focus more carefully on his assigned duties. Walking back to his quarters, Marcus realized that he was now being watched. The very people he had served faithfully for 12 years now viewed him as a potential threat. The irony wasn't lost on him that his crime was caring too much about the oath he had taken to protect the king and the kingdom. That afternoon, Marcus was reassigned to duties that kept him away from sensitive areas of the palace. Instead of the restricted wing, he was posted at the main gates, a position typically given to newer guards or those who had fallen out of favor. The message was subtle but unmistakable. As he stood at his new post, watching nobles come and go in their expensive carriages, Marcus thought about the desperate man from the northern provinces making his way home with no hope of justice. He thought about families losing their homes while the people responsible for protecting them grew wealthy from their suffering. The weight of his uniform felt different now. The symbols of honor and service seemed like mockery when worn in service of a system that had become so corrupted. Marcus realized that his choice wasn't between loyalty and disloyalty, but between two different kinds of loyalty: blind obedience to authority, or faithful service to the principles that authority was supposed to represent. That evening, as his shift ended, Marcus made another decision that would push him further down a path from which there would be no return. He began to carefully document everything he had learned, creating a detailed record of the corruption that was poisoning the kingdom from within. He wrote by candlelight in his small quarters, recording names, dates, and specific instances of abuse. He copied the documents he had found in the archives and wrote detailed accounts of conversations he had overheard. With each word he wrote, Marcus felt the weight of his old life falling away and something new and dangerous taking its place. The guard who had once found comfort in routine and unquestioning service was becoming someone else entirely, someone who understood that true honor sometimes required the courage to stand alone against those in power, even when that power claimed to represent everything he had sworn to protect. Marcus spent the following weeks walking a tightrope between his public duties and his private investigation. During the day, he performed his reassigned tasks with perfect precision, giving his superiors no reason to question his loyalty further. But during his off hours, he became a detective, carefully gathering evidence of the conspiracy that was destroying the kingdom from within. His new position at the main gates, initially intended as a demotion, actually provided him with unexpected opportunities. Merchants, visitors, and messengers passed through daily, and Marcus learned to engage them in casual conversation that revealed crucial information about conditions throughout the realm. Grain merchant mentioned how regional officials were forcing him to sell his goods at below-market prices, then reselling them for massive profits. A messenger spoke quietly about villages where people were disappearing after complaining about tax collectors. A traveling priest described churches being stripped of their treasures to fund the lavish lifestyles of corrupt governors. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle Marcus was assembling. The corruption wasn't random or opportunistic. It was systematic and carefully organized. Someone was coordinating these activities across multiple provinces, using the king's authority to legitimize theft and oppression on a massive scale. The breakthrough came when Marcus overheard a conversation between two minor nobles who didn't recognize him as anything more than a common guard. They spoke carelessly about a meeting that would take place in 3 days, where the northern arrangement would be finalized. They mentioned Lord Blackwood and several other council members, along with regional governors who would be traveling to the capital. Marcus realized this was his chance to gather concrete evidence of the conspiracy's scope. But attending such a meeting would require him to take risks that could cost him his life if he was discovered. He spent 2 sleepless nights weighing his options, knowing that inaction was becoming as much of a choice as action. On the night of the secret meeting, Marcus used his knowledge of the palace's hidden passages to position himself where he could observe without being seen. The meeting took place in a private dining room, typically used for intimate royal gatherings. But tonight it hosted a very different kind of assembly. What Marcus witnessed was a business meeting disguised as a social dinner. Lord Blackwood presided over the gathering like a criminal mastermind, coordinating the activities of regional governors who reported on their success in extracting wealth from their territories. They spoke casually about families they had ruined and villages they had impoverished, treating human suffering as mere statistics in their profit calculations. The most shocking revelation was the involvement of Captain Reynolds. Marcus watched in horror as his former commanding officer participated in the discussion, providing information about palace security and which guards could be trusted to look the other way. The captain who had mentored Marcus and taught him about honor was nothing more than another corrupt official enriching himself at the expense of the people he had sworn to protect. As the evening progressed, Marcus learned the full scope of their operation. They had been systematically replacing honest officials with corrupt ones, creating a network that stretched across the entire kingdom. They used the king's seal to authorize their actions, forging documents that made their theft appear legal and legitimate. The most devastating part was learning how they kept the king ignorant of their activities. They carefully controlled what information reached him, presenting false reports that painted a picture of prosperity and contentment throughout the realm. When problems did surface, they were presented as isolated incidents caused by external factors beyond anyone's control. Marcus also learned about the fate of those who had tried to expose the truth. The desperate man from the northern provinces wasn't the first to seek justice at the palace, but previous whistleblowers had been quietly eliminated before they could reach the king. Some had simply disappeared, while others had been arrested on fabricated charges and executed for treason. As the meeting concluded, the conspirators discussed their plans for the coming months. They intended to increase their activities, knowing that the king's declining health made him less likely to notice inconsistencies in their reports. They spoke of expanding their network to the southern provinces and installing additional corrupt officials in key positions. Marcus barely made it back to his quarters before his legs gave out from the shock of what he had learned. The scope of the betrayal was overwhelming, and the danger he now faced was far greater than he had imagined. These weren't simply greedy officials skimming profits. They were traitors who had essentially seized control of the kingdom while leaving the king as a powerless figurehead. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. Marcus realized that he might be the only person in the entire palace who both knew the truth and was still loyal to the real king. Everyone else had either been bought, threatened into silence, or eliminated entirely. Sleep became impossible as Marcus grappled with the magnitude of his situation. He possessed information that could save the kingdom, but he had no way to safely deliver it to the king. The very people who controlled access to the monarch were the ones orchestrating the conspiracy against him. Marcus thought about his fellow guards, wondering how many of them knew the truth and had chosen to remain silent out of fear or greed. He realized that his years of faithful service had been protecting a lie, that his loyalty had been manipulated to serve the very enemies he had sworn to fight against. The next morning brought a new challenge when Captain Reynolds summoned Marcus for another private conversation. This time the captain's demeanor was different. There was no pretense of concern or fatherly guidance. Instead, Marcus faced a man who was measuring him for a threat level. The captain asked pointed questions about Marcus's activities and observations. He wanted to know if Marcus had noticed anything unusual in his duties, if he had spoken with any visitors about sensitive matters, and if he had any concerns about palace security that needed to be addressed. Marcus realized this was a test. His answers would determine whether he was viewed as a manageable problem or a threat that needed to be eliminated. Drawing on years of training in composure under pressure, he provided responses that were truthful, enough to be believable but vague enough to avoid revealing his true knowledge. The conversation ended with the captain assigning Marcus to new duties that would keep him even further from sensitive areas of the palace. He would be responsible for supervising the night watch in the servants' quarters, a position that was clearly meant to isolate him from any important information. As Marcus left the captain's office, he understood that he was running out of time. The conspirators were becoming suspicious of him, and it wouldn't be long before they decided he was too dangerous to leave alive. His window for action was closing rapidly, and soon he would have to choose between saving himself and saving the kingdom he had sworn to protect. The isolation of his new assignment gave Marcus time to think, but thinking only made his situation more desperate. Supervising the night watch in the servants' quarters meant he was surrounded by people who knew nothing of palace politics and had no power to help, even if they did. He was effectively in exile within his own workplace, cut off from any opportunity to act on the knowledge that was burning inside him. During his rounds through the servants' quarters, Marcus began to notice something that gave him a glimmer of hope. The kitchen staff, laundry workers, and maintenance crews saw everything that happened in the palace, even if they didn't understand its significance. They moved through every corridor, entered every room, and heard fragments of conversations that the speakers thought were private. Marcus started carefully engaging the servants in conversation, not asking direct questions, but listening to their casual observations about the unusual activities they had witnessed. A kitchen maid mentioned seeing Lord Blackwood's quarters receiving multiple late-night deliveries of heavy chests. A maintenance worker spoke about being ordered to install new locks on certain rooms and being told never to enter them without special permission. Most revealing was an elderly seamstress who had been working in the palace for over 30 years. She had noticed changes in the behavior of various officials and had her own theories about what was happening. Unlike the younger servants, she had lived through previous political upheavals and recognized the signs of corruption and conspiracy. The seamstress Martha became Marcus's unexpected ally. She had no official power, but her decades of service had made her nearly invisible to the nobles who barely acknowledged her existence. She could move through the palace freely, observing and listening without arousing suspicion. Through Martha, Marcus learned about a network of communication that existed entirely below the notice of the corrupt officials. The servants had their own ways of sharing information, and many of them had pieced together enough details to understand that something terrible was happening to the kingdom they served. Martha revealed that she had been documenting strange occurrences in a diary she kept hidden in her quarters. She had noticed the pattern of honest officials being replaced with corrupt ones, had observed the increasing wealth of certain council members, and had witnessed the fear that was spreading throughout the palace staff. Together, Marcus and Martha began to develop a plan that seemed impossible, but might be their only hope. They would need to find a way to get information directly to the king, bypassing the network of corrupt officials who controlled all normal channels of communication. The challenge was enormous. The king was essentially a prisoner in his own palace, surrounded by people who were systematically deceiving him. His daily schedule was controlled by the very people who were betraying him, and his information sources had been compromised or eliminated. Marcus learned from Martha that the king had been suffering from periodic illnesses that kept him confined to his chambers for days at a time. During these periods, important decisions were made by the council in his name, using his seal to authorize actions he never saw. The timing of these illnesses seemed suspiciously convenient for the conspirators. The breakthrough came when Martha discovered that one of the king's personal physicians was not part of the conspiracy. Dr. Harrison was an elderly man who had served the royal family for decades and was genuinely concerned about the king's declining health. He had been expressing private doubts about some of the medications being prescribed and was beginning to suspect that external factors were contributing to the king's condition. Marcus realized that Dr. Harrison might be their pathway to the truth. But approaching the physician would require extreme caution, as even honest officials were being watched for signs of disloyalty. They would need to find a way to contact him that wouldn't alert the conspirators to their activities. The opportunity arose when Dr. Harrison was called to treat a servant who had been injured in a kitchen accident. Marcus arranged to be present during the medical visit, ostensibly to ensure the doctor's security while he worked in the servants' quarters. During the treatment, Marcus managed to have a brief private conversation with Dr. Harrison. Speaking in careful code, he suggested that the doctor might want to investigate whether the king's medications were being tampered with. He mentioned that certain servants had noticed unusual substances being delivered to the royal chambers and expressed concern for the king's well-being. Dr. Harrison's reaction told Marcus that his suspicions had found fertile ground. The physician had clearly been harboring his own doubts about the king's treatment regimen and was relieved to find someone else who shared his concerns. Over the following days, Dr. Harrison conducted his own investigation and discovered evidence that the king was being slowly poisoned. The substances weren't lethal, but they were designed to keep him weak and confused, making him more dependent on his advisors and less likely to question their decisions. The doctor's findings provided the final piece of evidence Marcus needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. The corrupt officials weren't just stealing from the kingdom. They were systematically incapacitating the king to ensure their continued control. Dr. Harrison agreed to help expose the truth, but he warned that they would need irrefutable evidence to overcome the conspirators' influence. Any accusation they made would need to be supported by documentation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Marcus knew this meant he would have to take even greater risks to obtain the evidence they needed. He would have to return to the restricted areas of the palace, access documents that were heavily guarded, and possibly confront people who wouldn't hesitate to kill him if they discovered his activities. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Marcus understood that he might be the kingdom's last hope for justice, but he also knew that one mistake could result in his death and the permanent victory of the conspirators. The loyal guard who had once found comfort in simple duties was now facing the most complex and dangerous challenge of his life. As he prepared for what might be his final mission, Marcus thought about the oath he had taken 12 years earlier. He had promised to protect the king and the kingdom, even at the cost of his own life. Now he faced the ultimate test of that promise. Knowing that true loyalty might require him to risk everything, he had built in service of principles that transcended his personal safety. The palace that had been his home for over a decade now felt like enemy territory. Every corridor held potential threats. Every conversation might be a trap, and every person he encountered could be either an ally or an enemy. But Marcus had come too far to turn back, and the suffering of innocent people throughout the kingdom demanded that he find the courage to continue forward, no matter what the cost might be. The plan Marcus and Dr. Harrison developed required precise timing and extraordinary courage. They would need to gather enough evidence to prove the conspiracy, while simultaneously finding a way to present it to the king when he was lucid and free from the influence of the poison medications. Dr. Harrison began secretly reducing the dosage of the harmful substances in the king's treatment, disguising his actions as adjustments to improve the monarch's overall health. Meanwhile, Marcus used his knowledge of palace security to plan one final infiltration of the restricted archives, where the most damning evidence was stored. The night of their operation, Marcus felt the weight of 12 years of loyal service pressing down on him as he prepared to commit what would technically be considered treason against his commanding officers. But he had come to understand that loyalty to corrupt authority was itself a betrayal of everything he truly believed in. Using the servant passages that Martha had shown him, Marcus made his way to the archives under cover of darkness. The documents he needed were stored in Lord Blackwood's private office, a room that was heavily secured and constantly monitored. But Marcus had observed the guard rotations carefully and identified a brief window when the area would be unprotected. Breaking into Lord Blackwood's office felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Marcus had spent his entire career respecting authority and following orders without question. Now he was burglarizing the office of one of the kingdom's highest officials, knowing that discovery would mean immediate execution for treason. The documents he found exceeded even his worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. There were detailed plans for expanding the corruption network throughout the entire kingdom. Financial records showed millions of gold coins stolen from the royal treasury. Correspondence revealed agreements with foreign enemies who were paying the conspirators to weaken the kingdom from within. Most horrifying were the lists of people who had been eliminated for asking inconvenient questions. Marcus recognized names of honest officials who had supposedly died in accidents or been transferred to distant posts. The reality was that they had been murdered to protect the conspiracy's secrets. As Marcus copied the most critical documents, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. His heart raced as he realized someone was approaching the office earlier than expected. He quickly gathered the evidence he had already copied and looked for a place to hide, but the footsteps stopped directly outside the door. The sound of keys jingling told Marcus that someone was about to enter the office. With no other option, he slipped behind a large tapestry that covered one wall, pressing himself against the cold stone and trying to control his breathing as the door opened. Lord Blackwood entered the office with Captain Reynolds, and their conversation revealed that Marcus's activities had not gone unnoticed. They knew someone was gathering information about their operations, and they had narrowed their suspicions to a small group of people that included Marcus. The captain reported that Marcus had been seen in areas where he shouldn't have been and had been asking questions that suggested dangerous knowledge. Lord Blackwood's response was chilling in its casual brutality. He ordered that Marcus be arrested the following morning on charges of theft and treason, with a quick execution to follow. Marcus remained frozen behind the tapestry as the two men discussed their plans for eliminating other potential threats. They mentioned Dr. Harrison with particular concern, having noticed his recent changes to the king's medication regimen. They planned to have the physician arrested as well, charging him with attempting to poison the monarch. The irony of the false charge against Dr. Harrison wasn't lost on Marcus. The man who was actually trying to save the king from poisoning would be executed for the very crime the conspirators were committing. It was a perfect example of how completely they had corrupted the system of justice. After what felt like hours, Lord Blackwood and Captain Reynolds finally left the office. Marcus waited several more minutes before emerging from his hiding place, knowing that this would likely be his last opportunity to act. He had perhaps 6 hours before his arrest, and he needed to use that time to expose the truth. Returning to his quarters, Marcus found Martha waiting for him with urgent news. Dr. Harrison had successfully cleared enough of the poison from the king's system that the monarch was beginning to regain his mental clarity. For the first time in months, the king was asking pointed questions about kingdom affairs and demanding to see original documents rather than summaries prepared by his advisors. This was their moment, but it was also incredibly dangerous. The conspirators would soon realize that the king was becoming more alert, and they would likely accelerate their plans to maintain control. Marcus and his allies had a narrow window to act before the situation became even more desperate. Marcus made the decision to approach the king directly, knowing that this action would seal his fate regardless of the outcome. He prepared a comprehensive package of evidence, including the documents he had copied, Dr. Harrison's findings about the poisoning, and detailed testimony about everything he had witnessed over the past weeks. The challenge was reaching the king without alerting the conspirators. The monarch's schedule was controlled by the very people who were betraying him, and his chambers were guarded by soldiers whose loyalty was questionable. Marcus would need to find a way to bypass all normal security protocols. Dr. Harrison provided the solution by arranging for an emergency medical consultation that would require him to see the king immediately. As the royal physician, he had the authority to demand immediate access, even overriding the objections of guards and advisors. Marcus concealed himself among the medical supplies that Dr. Harrison brought to the royal chambers. It was a desperate gambit, but their alternatives had been eliminated by the timeline the conspirators had imposed. As they made their way through the palace corridors, Marcus felt the weight of the evidence he carried and the knowledge that the kingdom's fate might depend on the next few hours. The moment of truth was approaching, and Marcus understood that his life as a simple guard was ending forever. Whether he survived the next few hours or not, he would either die as a traitor or live as the man who saved the kingdom from its greatest internal threat. The choice between those fates no longer belonged to him. It rested with the king he had sworn to serve, and the justice he hoped still existed somewhere within the corrupted system he was challenging. The royal chambers felt different as Marcus emerged from his hiding place among Dr. Harrison's medical supplies. King Aldrich, though still weak from months of poisoning, possessed a clarity in his eyes that Marcus hadn't seen in ages. The monarch looked older and frailer than Marcus remembered, but his mind was sharp as Dr. Harrison's treatments had begun to clear away the fog of toxic substances. Dr. Harrison quickly explained the situation to the king, presenting the medical evidence of the systematic poisoning first. The king's reaction was a mixture of rage and heartbreak as he realized how completely he had been betrayed by those he trusted most. When Dr. Harrison introduced Marcus and explained his role in uncovering the conspiracy, the king studied the guard with new recognition. Marcus knelt before his monarch and presented the evidence he had gathered over the past weeks. The financial documents, correspondence with foreign enemies, lists of murdered officials, and detailed accounts of the conspiracy's operations painted a picture of betrayal so comprehensive that even the king struggled to absorb its full implications. As King Outrage reviewed the evidence, his expression hardened into something Marcus had never seen before. This wasn't just anger at being deceived. It was the fury of a ruler who had discovered that his kingdom was being destroyed from within, while he was helpless to stop it. The gentle king who had always sought peaceful solutions was transforming into someone capable of the decisive action their situation demanded. The king's first question was about the scope of the conspiracy's reach. Marcus provided detailed information about which officials were involved, how the network operated across different provinces, and how they had managed to maintain their deception for so long. The picture that emerged showed a shadow government that had effectively seized control of the kingdom while leaving the king as a powerless figurehead. Dr. Harrison explained the medical aspects of their control, describing how the poisoning had been carefully calibrated to keep the king weak and confused without actually killing him. The conspirators needed him alive to legitimize their actions, but incapacitated enough that he wouldn't interfere with their operations. King Outrage's response was swift and decisive. Despite his physical weakness, his mind was now clear enough to understand exactly what needed to be done. He began drafting orders that would dismantle the conspiracy and restore legitimate authority to the kingdom. But first, they needed to secure the palace and ensure that the corrupt officials couldn't escape or destroy evidence. The king used his emergency authority to summon guards, who had been identified as loyal through Dr. Harrison's careful observation and Marcus's intelligence gathering. These men were brought to the royal chambers individually, sworn to secrecy, and given specific orders to secure key locations throughout the palace. Marcus found himself appointed as the temporary head of palace security, a position that felt surreal after his weeks of operating in the shadows. But his comprehensive knowledge of the conspiracy's operations made him the logical choice to coordinate the arrests and evidence gathering that would follow. The first arrests began at dawn, just hours before Marcus was scheduled to be arrested himself. Lord Blackwood was taken into custody in his chambers, along with the incriminating documents that Marcus had previously photographed. Captain Reynolds was arrested while attempting to destroy files in his office, providing additional evidence of guilt. The speed and coordination of the operation caught the conspirators completely off guard. They had become so confident in their control that they hadn't prepared for the possibility that their activities might be discovered. Within hours, the entire network was in custody, and the evidence of their crimes was secured. The interrogations that followed revealed the full extent of the damage they had caused. Millions of gold coins had been stolen from the royal treasury and distributed among the conspirators and their foreign allies. Honest officials throughout the kingdom had been systematically eliminated and replaced with corrupt appointees. Entire regions had been essentially sold to the highest bidder, with the profits flowing to the conspirators rather than the royal treasury. King Outrage's response was proportional to the magnitude of their crimes. The leaders of the conspiracy were sentenced to death for treason, while their subordinates faced imprisonment and forfeiture of their illegally gained wealth. The foreign allies who had paid for information and influence were expelled from the kingdom and their assets seized. More importantly, the king began the massive task of rebuilding the legitimate government structures that had been corrupted or destroyed. Honest officials were restored to positions they had been forced to leave, and new appointees were carefully vetted to ensure their loyalty and integrity. Marcus played a crucial role in this restoration process. His detailed knowledge of how the conspiracy had operated helped identify areas where reform was most urgently needed. His reputation as the guard who had risked everything to expose the truth made him a trusted advisor in the king's efforts to rebuild confidence in royal authority. The kingdom's recovery was slow but steady. The stolen wealth was recovered and used to provide aid to the regions that had suffered most under the corrupt officials. Tax policies were reformed to eliminate the opportunities for skimming that had funded the conspiracy. New oversight mechanisms were established to prevent similar corruption from taking root in the future. For Marcus personally, the events transformed his understanding of what loyalty truly meant. He had learned that blind obedience to authority could become complicity in evil, while true loyalty sometimes required the courage to challenge those in power when they betrayed the principles they were supposed to represent. The king recognized Marcus's service with a promotion to captain of the royal guard, but more importantly, he established new protocols that would protect future whistleblowers and ensure that similar conspiracies could never again operate with impunity. The palace that had once harbored corruption became a model of transparency and accountability. Years later, as Marcus walked the same marble corridors where his crisis of conscience had begun, he reflected on how much had changed. The portraits of ancient kings no longer seemed to be watching him with suspicion. Instead, they appeared to be nodding with approval at the restoration of honor to their halls. The weight of his uniform now felt different as well. Instead of representing blind obedience to authority, it symbolized his commitment to the principles of justice and truth that gave authority its legitimacy. Marcus had learned that the greatest act of loyalty was sometimes the courage to say no to those who demanded unquestioning obedience while betraying everything they claimed to represent. The kingdom had been saved not by grand military victories or diplomatic triumphs, but by the quiet courage of individuals who chose to do what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Marcus's story became a reminder that true honor sometimes required the greatest sacrifice of all, the willingness to risk everything in service of principles that transcended personal safety and comfort.